The morning she ran into Kyle at the farmer's market, Audra was holding a half-eaten peach and wearing paint-stained sneakers, and her daughter was loudly negotiating the price of a single strawberry with a very patient vendor. Not exactly the entrance she would have chosen. Kyle looked the same. That was the infuriating part. Same easy posture, same jaw that belonged on a cologne ad, same way of standing like the world had arranged itself specifically for his comfort. The woman beside him was laughing at something he'd said, her hand looped through his elbow, a ring catching the morning light like it was trying to make a point. Audra looked down at her peach. Mom. Her daughter, Beta, 4 years old, relentless, the best thing that had ever happened to her, tugged at her sleeve. Mom, the lady says $1.50 is too much for one strawberry. She's right, Audra said, mostly to herself. And that's when Kyle saw her. The recognition hit his face in stages. Surprise first. Then something she could only describe as amusement. That old, comfortable amusement he'd always had around her, like she was a story he already knew the ending to. Audra. He said her name the way he always had, like a period at the end of a sentence. Kyle. She matched his energy. Flat. Measured. His eyes dropped to Bea, who had abandoned the strawberry negotiation and was now standing beside Audra with both arms wrapped around her mother's leg, staring up at this tall stranger with open suspicion. Wow, Kyle said. So you actually did it. The whole, he gestured vaguely, single mom thing. Not a compliment, not quite an insult. Just that particular brand of condescension he'd perfected over the 3 years they'd dated, the tone that said, I always knew you'd end up somewhere smaller than you imagined. Audra smiled. Yup, that's, he tilted his head, brave. The woman on his arm glanced between them with the polite discomfort of someone who understood she'd walked into something but couldn't quite read the map. This is Madison, Kyle said. We just got engaged. Congratulations, Audra said, and she meant it in the specific way that means I genuinely do not care. She bought Bea the strawberry. She paid the $1.50 without negotiating. And she walked away without looking back, even though every nerve in her body was aware of exactly where Kyle was standing and exactly what expression was probably on his face. Bea ate the strawberry in 2 bites and immediately wanted another one. Audra laughed, a real laugh, sudden and loose, and thought, he has no idea. She'd opened the café 4 years ago, 11 weeks after Bea was born, on a Thursday in October, when she probably should have still been sleeping. It was called Grove, which her mother said sounded like a cemetery, but which Audra had chosen because she wanted something that implied roots, something that grew slowly and stayed. The space was on the corner of Finley and 9th, in a part of town that was half Jennified and half stubborn, and the regulars had adopted it with the kind of fierce loyalty that still surprised her some mornings. The barista she'd hired first, a woman named Tori, who wore the same green earrings every day, and had opinions about milk foam that bordered on philosophical, had been there from the beginning and showed no signs of leaving. Audra did the books every Sunday evening at the corner table by the window. Bea usually fell asleep somewhere between the receipts and the invoices, tucked into the oversized chair Audra had dragged in from an estate sale, wrapped in the blanket she'd crocheted herself during a particularly slow February. The business was good. Not spectacular, not yet, but steady and real, the kind of good she'd built herself with both hands. The café was hers. Bea was hers. The life she'd made in the 4 years since Kyle had sat across from her at their kitchen table and said very calmly that he didn't think she was the kind of woman he needed to be with anymore. That life was hers too. She'd cried for exactly 1 week. Then Bea had kicked for the first time, that unmistakable flutter in her ribs, and Audra had put her hand on her stomach and made a private decision. We're going to be fine. They were. What she hadn't told Kyle at the farmer's market, what she hadn't told anyone actually, except Tori and her mother and her attorney, was that 8 months ago, on a quiet Wednesday evening in December, she had gotten married. His name was Rowan Cross. She'd met him the way you meet people when you own a cafe and you're there at 6 in the morning most days. He'd walked in during a rainstorm, asked for a black coffee, and then sat at the counter for 3 hours without saying much of anything. He came back the next day, and the next. After 2 weeks, she knew his order. After a month, she knew his name. After 6 weeks, She'd started looking up from whatever she was doing when the door opened, not consciously, just orienting toward him. He wasn't the type of man who announced himself. That was the first thing she'd noticed. He didn't take up space loudly. He was tall and quiet, and he read actual physical books, which she appreciated, and he tipped like he was embarrassed about having money, which made her curious. "You don't have to leave that much," she said once, sliding the extra bills back across the counter. He looked at her steadily. "I know." He left the same amount the next morning. She found out about the Cross family the same way most people in the city did, through the newspapers, through the vague social understanding that certain last names carried weight that had nothing to do with charm or credentials. The Cross family had been in the city for 3 generations. Real estate, primarily. And then, if you followed the quieter threads, other things. Tori had looked it up online after the 3rd week and presented her findings with the solemnity of a research report. He's like, actually rich, Audra. Like the kind of rich where it stops being a word. He tips well, Audra said. That's what I'm saying. Audra hadn't grown up in a world that intersected with people like Rowan Cross. Her father had been a school teacher. Her mother still couponed. She'd put herself through culinary school on loans and waitressing shifts, and she'd learned early that certain kinds of men, the kind with that particular ease of movement, that specific confidence that came from never having worried about money, those men tended to want certain things from women like her, and none of those things were permanent. So she'd been careful. She'd been friendly and professional, and she'd not let herself think too much about the way he looked at her when she wasn't looking directly back. And then, one evening in April, when the last customer had gone and she was wiping down the counter, he'd said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Would you be willing to have dinner with me?" She'd looked at him. He'd looked back. Neither of them was performing anything. "I have a 4-year-old, she said, because that was always the sentence. The sentence that sorted people. "I know," he said. "I've seen her in here on Sunday evenings. She's loud. She seems wonderful." Audra considered him for a moment, the book on the counter, the coffee cup he'd pushed to the side so he wasn't talking over it, the fact that he'd asked, simply, instead of assuming. "Okay," she said. The dinner was quiet and specific, and not at all what she'd expected. He took her to a small Italian place in the West End, not flashy, not trying to prove anything, and he asked her questions about the café and actually listened to the answers. Not in the way men sometimes listen, which is really just waiting for the next opportunity to talk about themselves. He listened like he was genuinely interested in the architecture of her life, like the details mattered. She asked him about his work. He was careful without being evasive, gave her the broad strokes, the above-board version, and she understood without him saying, so that there were parts he wasn't going to lay out on a first dinner. She respected that. She had a good read on people. It had kept her safe more than once. What she saw, sitting across from him in the warm light of that restaurant, a man who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. A man who chose quietness deliberately. A man who looked at her like she was a specific person, not a category. She went home that night and told her mother about him on the phone. "Is he kind?" her mother asked. Audra thought about it. "Yeah," she said. "I think he actually is. Then don't overthink it." She tried. She met his world gradually. He didn't rush it, which she noticed and appreciated. The first time she understood, really understood, the full weight of what the Cross name meant. She was at a charity event he'd taken her to, 6 months in, and she watched 3 different men approach him in the span of an hour with the specific body language of people who needed something and knew exactly who had the power to give it. Rowan was perfectly polite with all of them. He made nothing out of it. On the way home, she was quiet. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm just." She searched for the word. "Processing." He nodded. He didn't push. She called Tori the next morning. "I think I understand what you meant," she said. "About the kind of rich where it stops being a word." "Yeah," Tori said. "It's fine," Audra said. And then, because it was Tori, and she didn't have to perform anything, "I'm a little scared." "Of him?" She thought about it honestly. "No. Of how much I'm not scared of him." There were things she didn't ask about directly. She wasn't naive. She understood that the Cross family's reach, extended into areas that didn't advertise themselves in daylight. She'd grown up enough, seen enough, to understand that certain structures in certain cities were maintained by certain men in certain ways, and that the world was complicated, and that people she'd known her whole life were more layered than their surface suggested. What she knew about Rowan was what she'd seen directly. He was patient with Bia from the very first time she'd introduced them, hadn't tried to be her father, hadn't overcorrected into buddy territory, had simply been present and consistent, and had let Bia decide the pace. Bia, who trusted no one quickly, who had her mother's instincts and then some, had started asking for him within 3 months. "Is Rowan coming Sunday?" she'd asked one morning over cereal, with the casual tone of someone asking about the weather. Audra had looked at her daughter for a moment. "You want him to?" Bea considered this. "He doesn't make the coffee weird. Some people make the coffee weird." This was a reference to an ex-boyfriend Audra had briefly dated 2 years earlier, who had tried too hard and offered Bea a frothy cappuccino at 7:30 in the morning. Bea had never forgiven him. "Okay," Audra said. "I'll ask him." He'd proposed on a Wednesday, which she later thought was perfect. Not a weekend, not a holiday, not some orchestrated evening with soft lighting and choreographed surprise. A Wednesday in November when they were sitting on her couch after Bea was asleep and he'd been quiet for a while, and then he'd said her name in a way that made her put down her book. He had a ring. He hadn't shown it yet. He'd said what he wanted to say first, which was that he knew what her life was and what she'd built, and that he wasn't asking her to rearrange any of it. That Bea was already. He paused here, and she saw something move through him. Already someone he would protect without being asked. That he understood if she needed more time. That he was asking because he didn't want more time. "I'm not a simple man to be with," he said. "I want you to know that clearly." "I know," she said, "and you're okay with that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her café and her daughter and the life she'd built from scratch, and she thought about the way she'd started looking up when the door opened, and the way Bea said his name without ceremony, and the way she felt in the particular silence of being with someone who didn't need her to fill every space. "I'm okay with that," she said. They got married in December at the courthouse, with Tori as witness and her mother on the phone from Phoenix because she'd sprained her ankle and couldn't make the flight. It was 13 minutes long. Afterward, they took Bea to get ice cream even though it was cold, and she sat between them in the booth and ate 2 scoops of mint chip and fell asleep on the drive home with her head against Rowan's arm. He looked down at her. Then he looked at Audra. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. She hadn't told Kyle any of this at the farmer's market, obviously. She'd said yep and bought Bea a strawberry and walked away, and she'd let him stand there with his assumptions intact, the ones that probably had her cataloged as the cautionary tale, the girl who'd gotten pregnant and opened a small business and was making the best of things. "Brave," he'd said, in that tone. She thought about it on the drive home, Bea asleep in her car seat, sticky strawberry fingers curled against her cheek. She thought about what it would have looked like from Kyle's angle. Her in her paint-stained sneakers, her daughter negotiating over fruit, no ring on her finger. Here's what Kyle didn't know. She didn't wear her ring to the farmer's market because she'd gotten paint on it the day before and left it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. She'd been refinishing a set of chairs she'd bought at an estate sale. She forgot things like that, jewelry, umbrellas, the second half of her coffee, when she was in the middle of a project. What Kyle also didn't know, the paint-stained sneakers were a deliberate choice, because the market had uneven pavement, and she'd turned her ankle there once. The car she was driving was not the old Civic he probably would have assumed. The cafe was not small in the way he meant it. Grove had a 6-month wait list for event bookings and had been written up twice in food publications. She'd never been able to afford to advertise in. And her husband was the kind of man whose name made certain other men go very still when they heard it. She didn't particularly want the satisfaction of Kyle knowing any of that. That was the thing she'd understood about herself in the years since they'd separated. She didn't need him to revise his opinion of her. His opinion of her was genuinely not a thing she carried anymore, but she'd laughed in the car quietly, so she didn't wake Bia. He has no idea. The call came 3 weeks later. She was at the cafe, in the back, going over invoices, when her phone rang. Rowan's name on the screen. He called during the day sometimes, but not usually in the middle of the week without warning. And something in the quality of the ring, which was irrational, rings didn't have qualities, but still made her pick up immediately. "Hey," she said. "Hey." His voice was the same, even unhurried. She'd learned in the past year to read the register under the surface, the fine adjustments. "Are you at Grove?" "Yeah." "Back office. Stay there. I'll come to you." "Rowan." She kept her voice level. "What's happening?" "A beat. It's nothing that affects you or Bia. I want to say that first. Okay. But there's something you should know. In person." She sat with the invoices spread in front of her and the afternoon light coming through the small window above the filing cabinet, and she thought about the moment she'd chosen this, the courthouse, the ice cream, the particular silence of him. She'd known then that his world carried weight she couldn't always see. She'd chosen it anyway. "Okay," she said again. "Come in through the back." He got there in 20 minutes. He sat down across from her at the small table in the back office, and he told her, without preamble, that there had been a situation with a man named Grayson, a name she'd heard once, obliquely, as part of a conversation she hadn't been meant to hear, and that Grayson had been attempting for some time to create problems for the Cross family, and that those problems had now resolved. "Resolved how?" she said. He met her eyes. "Legally. There are federal charges. He'll be indicted by the end of the week." "Were you?" she started. "I was careful," he said, "for a long time, because I knew where I wanted to end up." She understood what he meant. He'd been careful the way people were careful when they had something to protect, something they hadn't had before, and the thing he was protecting now was this: the Café Bea, the courthouse on a Wednesday in December, the ice cream in the cold. She looked at him across the small table in her small back office, in the cafe she'd built from scratch, and she thought, this is the man I chose, not the name, not the weight of it, the man. "Are you okay?" she asked. Something shifted in him, just slightly, like he'd braced for a different question and hadn't needed to. "Yeah," he said. "I am now." Kyle posted the engagement photos 3 weeks after the farmer's market. Madison in a floaty dress on a dock somewhere. Kyle looking like the cologne ad he'd always suggested. Tori, who followed him for reasons she described as research, sent Audra a screenshot without comment. Audra sent back a thumbs-up emoji and went back to the lemon cake she was testing for the fall menu. Bia was at preschool. The cafe was 2 hours from opening. The morning was hers, flour on her hands, radio on low, sunlight crossing the counter in a long flat stripe the color of honey. Her ring was back on her finger. She'd found it on the kitchen windowsill that same morning, exactly where she'd left it. She looked at it for a moment. Simple, heavy. His grandmother's stone, reset. Then she went back to the cake. She was humming something she couldn't name, something she'd heard Bia singing in the bath. Outside, the street was coming awake, the dry cleaner next door pulling up his gate, the sound of a delivery truck reversing, someone's dog making its morning opinions known. She wasn't thinking about Kyle. She hadn't been, really, since the farmer's market. He'd walked past the edge of her life, and she'd watched him go, and that had been that. What she was thinking about was the cake, and whether she had enough cardamom, and whether Bee's school had sent home the permission slip for the October field trip, and what Rowan had said last night about taking a long weekend somewhere in the fall, somewhere with trees and cold air and no particular agenda. She was thinking about her life, which was full and quiet and specifically hers. When the door opened, the back door, the one that required a code, she already knew the footsteps. She didn't turn around. "There's coffee," she said. "I know," Rowan said. "That's why I'm here." She heard him pour. She kept working. After a minute, he was beside her at the counter, close enough that she could feel the particular warmth of him, reading over her shoulder at the recipe with the mild interest of a man who loved the results and had no opinion about the process. "Cardamom," he said. "I think it needs it." "Then it needs it," she added the cardamom. Outside, the city kept waking up loud and various and entirely indifferent to the small, sturdy happiness of two people standing in a kitchen that smelled like lemon and coffee and everything they'd managed to build.